Well, our chapter deals not with a specific taxation issue, but more a development issue, namely uh, tax capacity building in developing countries. So as part of development assistance, helping developing countries build the capacity to build a fair and performant, efficient tax system that can then be used to for developing countries to reach their preferred revenue goals that they set themselves. And that is, of course, an issue that is linked with many of the SDGs. There are some SDGs that are explicitly linked with those issues, like 17.1 is the SDG that deals with domestic revenue mobilization. So the mobilization of the resources that are already present in developing countries right now, but that are untapped as of now, and the tax system is an important part of that, but also for financing the sustainable development goals as a whole. Taxation and an increase in public revenues in developing countries will be a necessary step for that. So that is the general stage of our chapter, and there are many actors in that field. It is tax capacity building is a very crowded governance field, and so there is a real need for coordination there. And that brings us to the specific topic of this chapter, which are the medium-term revenue strategies, which is a new tool developed by a cooperation between the IMF, the OECD, the World Bank, and the United Nations for in-country coordination of development for tax capacity building, according to the country's needs and with country ownership. And so our chapter is a critical evaluation of that concept in depth.
Well, this chapter on MTRS, Midterm Revenue Strategies, is in fact part of a wider research project of Wouter and mine, in which we looked at what's happening indeed within that fascinating, what we call regime complex of tax capacity building for domestic resource mobilization. In other words, that wide array of initiatives, institutions, also bilateral relationships that all have to do with supporting developing countries in raising domestic revenues through capacity building, tax capacity building. And indeed, many international institutions are involved, donors, also non-state actors, etc. And over the past few years, there were a few intriguing developments where we see that people in the field feel that indeed the landscape is too crowded, the regime or the regime complex has become too fragmented with inefficiencies and overlaps and duplications and gaps, so that an exercise has been started to coordinate, to consolidate the regime complex by fostering collaboration, synergies between players in this field. And we see that at the global level, the global multilateral level, where since some years there is the platform for collaboration on tax, which is a network organization consisting of IMF, World Bank, OECD, United Nations, as Wouter already pointed out. The PCT, one of its initiatives is these MTRSs, which try to achieve coordination within the regime complex at country level. And on principle, and that's also one of our conclusions, that makes a lot of sense for the matter of efficiency and synergy. But there are a few potential issues, even pitfalls. The PCT, as an organization which promotes this, stresses country ownership is going to be central. So the national government in those developing countries and its society should have the final word over this midterm strategy over a number of years to improve domestic resource mobilization. But as we know from experience, looking at partners involved like World Bank, IMF, that this has always been a tension, that issue of country ownership, because those powerful multilateral institutions help these countries in certain ways, grant them loans, financial difficulties with conditionality and with quite a lot of conflicts and disagreements and issues of ownership. So one of the challenges is going to be to make this country ownership in the MTRSs really happen. And perhaps a second point that we have seen already in some reporting of the PCT itself, and also in the recent reporting that came out from the PCT after we finished drafting the chapter, is that within the PCT, it's mostly IMF and World Bank who work on these MTRSs, and apparently for the time being, less involvement from OECD, United Nations, and then within UN, UNDP in particular, whereas the United Nations have lots of feeling with realities in developing countries, country presence, and could really contribute a lot in terms of putting developing countries' priorities first within this MTRS framework. And at a later stage, perhaps in research, we will be able to say more in terms of evaluation.
A lot of these coordination improvements, there's a wider dynamic around that. It's something that we've seen that each time centered mostly around the UN FFD conferences, the Finding for Development conferences. We each time see a sort of similar pattern. You know, there's a Finance for Development conference, and that's an agenda-setting moment for the entire field, including everything that has to do with international taxation and development. And so then a lot of initiatives happen relatively quickly, and then it goes on. A few years pass, some more things happen, but it slowly becomes more quiet. It dies out a bit until the next FFD conference. So the last one was in 2015 in the Addis Ababa conference, and this is one of the later stage products of a whole process that started with other coordination things like the establishment of the platform for collaboration on tax, like the ADIS tax initiative. So now we have this MTRS thing, something that the IMF was really raving on about, hammering on 2 years ago at the PCT conference in New York, but actually not a lot has happened around the concept lately. And of course, the whole COVID situation has a part in that. Probably, I think the IMF has more urgent priorities right now. But all in all, even though we are critical about it, this coordination thing, this MTRS thing, is a good thing. I think we think the balance at the end of the day is positive in terms of governance, in terms of effect on developing countries. So I hope that this track of more coordination and more attention towards DRM for tax capacity, for aid for DRM and for tax capacity building, that's something that that the international community will keep paying attention to in the coming years, so that we don't need another FFD conference in 3 or 4 years where we start the whole thing over again, where the whole scene again takes stock and says, okay, this is missing, this is missing, this is missing. And we put enormous amounts of energy again into creating new tools. So yeah, that's more of a hope than a policy recommendation, but it can be the same thing at once.